Let's see what the stew has for us today.
Welcome to the Gnomecast, a Gnome Stew's tabletop gaming advice podcast. Here we talk with the other gnomes about gaming things to avoid becoming part of the stew, so I guess we'd better be good. This episode is brought to you by awesome Patreon backers like the cultured Craig Dedrick, the esteemed Eric Heimel, and the fabulous Fabrice Boulacchia. Today we have myself, Ange, along with Jared and Phil, and we're going to talk about playing RPGs based on shows, movies, books, and more. In other words, playing with Canon. Before we dive into that main topic, though, we're going to ask our Get to Know a Gnome question, which, on that topic, is what is a setting you've never seen in an RPG that you would love to see brought to the table? Jared, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. This was funny because I had a couple ideas at first, and every time I came up with them, it was like, oh no, wait, there actually is a RPG either out or on the way for that. So after doing a bit of a dive on that, I settled in on the Greenbone Saga books from Fonda Lee. It's a supernatural wuxia series. It's modern times, but it's not Earth. It's an alternate culture, and people bond to Jade and they get superhuman powers, and it's a really neat kind of noir, superhero-ish wuxia storyline all mixed together, and I think it'd make a really cool RPG.
That does sound very cool. How about you, Phil?
I'm going to go with my White Whale, a game that I have talked about designing, actually just fixing up the rules to play it. This is the 1998 UPN show, 7 Days. I don't know if you remember this show or not.
Mm-hmm. I do not.
I will give a brief synopsis for any of our listeners who've not seen this show. This is a show where the U.S. government is in possession of a time machine that can only go back 7 days in the past. Otherwise, it gets too far off course and gets lost. And they use it to retroactively stop national disasters, events, and crises by, something would happen. They would investigate it, then they would take their agent, stuff him into the time machine, send him back up to 7 days, where he would come back and brief everybody on what was going to happen, and then they would take action to stop it. So it's essentially, it's a gumshoe game.
Yeah.
Except that you have to break the game into two parts, where all of the investigative moves have time limits because there's only so much you can investigate as the 7-day window closes. And then there's an action phase where you send, the person back with all the information, and then you actually try to thwart the attempt.
That sounds really cool. And it definitely does sound gumshoe, because you were talking about it and I'm like, what's the gumshoe game about time travel? It sounds a little like that, just much more constrained.
That's Time Watch. I actually think if I was going to do it, and I say think I'm going to do it because I am going to do it one day, it will be with Night's Black Agents, because it actually, if you watch the show, it actually fits Night's Black Agents very well. The main plot device is the twist is this time machine thing, where it's basically they're solving mysteries and thwarting dangers, but they've broken it. You get to see the disaster, then you get to discover what led to the disaster, and then they go back in time and stop the disaster. It's perfect. It's a really cheesy show from the 90s, but I've never let go of it. So
there's actually a fair number of cheesy shows from the 90s that had really interesting concepts.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Ange?
Mine, I actually just finished playing the video game the other day. I want to play in the Horizon world. Horizon Zero Dawn, Horizon Forbidden West. I've even gotten to the point where I messaged my friend that has been playing it kind of parallel to me. I'm like, okay, here's the PCs. We're going to have an Oseram Tinker. We're going to have a Tanakh Chaplain. We're going to have a Nutaru Archer. We're going to have a Quen Scout. We're going to have a this and a that, and we're going to do it. And she's like, I'm doing the art.
Let me just say this. If this game came out in 5e, I would play it. That is, I normally grumble every time a property comes out only in 5e, whatever. If Horizon came out even if it comes out in 5e, I will play this game. 100%.
My thought right now is to actually do it in Savage Worlds, because it's super flexible. I know Savage Worlds. I could make this happen. I even have the idea of having a skill specifically called Focus, whether or not the character can actually use a focus and get information out of it. I was thinking that was an interesting idea.
Spend a penny to slow down time?
Oh.
Right? Spend a penny to slow down time to get like an extra action or extra dice to your roll. Like, oh yeah. Like
Actually, that extra time is all just me aiming because
you gotta raid the entire skill tree of those games and like turn all of those into bonuses, right? Like those all have to be moves in the game.
Oh, this is my game, and I'm already talking about I may be bringing this to the table sometime this summer or fall as a thrown together Savage Worlds game. We'll
It's
see.
genius. It's genius. It's so good. That game is so good if you've never played it. Like I have not played the new one. I've only started the first one before I got lost in playing No Man's Sky. But it's just amazing.
It's
Such a good
so well done. So well done. If I don't move us off of this topic, I will wax poetic.
That'll be what the show will be about tonight.
Yeah.
And then I'll be sitting here going, yeah, it's on my wish list.
All right, let's get Jared back in the game here.
Okay, so speaking of Jared has recently started talking about starting up a Star Trek game. And I know that Phil is super into Star Trek, and I fully plan on playing in Jared's game. I think he's on board with this. So, let's talk about playing RPGs that boldly go where no one has gone before, or at least, let's be honest, have gone many times before. Playing in existing settings. It has existed since the early days of RPGs, and it speaks of our loves of all things Trek. The very first licensed RPG ever published was Heritage's Star Trek Adventure Gaming in the Final Frontier way back in 1978. Now, there are generally three ways I think we can approach this topic. The first is using something as inspiration and a springboard, but not necessarily sticking too close to the specifics of the source material. Second, playing in the setting, but with completely original characters. And then third, finally, playing in the setting with the well-known characters from those stories. Like I say, every time I bring Firefly to the table, people come just looking for a second season episode. So, let's talk about this. Phil, I'm going to throw it to you first, and we're going to start talking about using other material as inspiration.
Yeah. So when you're looking at when you are inspired by canon material, but you don't want to run the canon game. And there's a number of reasons you might want to do that. Like you might not want to get into the whole like canon wars about, whether this is true or not, or maybe it's a canon that you really like, but you're not the expert at it in your group. And you don't want to you don't want to throw down your Star Trek game and then somebody's sitting at the table the whole time, like, well, actually in episode, you may want to avoid that, or for any number of reasons, right? You just don't want, you want a game to feel like Star Trek, for instance, but not actually be Star Trek. So the way you do this is a technique that I think is an established term on the internet called filing off the serial numbers. We've talked about this on Pandas Talking Games. I've talked about it on Misdirected Mark. But essentially what you're doing is you are removing all the media-specific trappings from either concepts, items, characters, whatever, so that they're not recognizable as the original piece of media, but in turn, you've kept the concepts so that they're playable in your game. And you just basically, you repaint them with your setting.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I'm running this game in Cortex Prime right now that's called Aux. Long story about the name, but don't worry about the name. And it's about a group of super geniuses traveling around the galaxy, heading off disasters on planets, using their super genius skills. It is, in a nutshell, in some ways, Star Trek. They are basically just flying around. There's no Federation. There's no Enterprise. They have a ship. It's a sentient ship, so it's actually more like Discovery. But there's no Federation. There's no recognizable species in the game or anything. But it is definitely heavily inspired by those Trek episodes what's the one? Oh, the one where Q loses his powers and the moon is about to decay and fall into the planet, and they have to figure out how to move the moon, right? Those are that's the kind of inspiration for this game. And it's pretty unrecognizable because I've taken away the Federation, I've taken away any canon characters, any of the technology, but have kept the spirit of that game by looking at what made those episodes interesting and fun, and just peeling off that layer of canon and just transporting those things into a different world and kind of, wrapping them up in that campaign setting.
And I think we can also talk about the fact that it is also very easy to do this type of thing, taking inspiration from some other material and using it as like an adventure creation, adventure prompt rather than just a whole campaign. I ran a D&D game that was essentially borrowing the plot from Stardust, the Neil Gaiman story. It was, they had to find a MacGuffin to prove who could be king or queen or, just the person in charge. And I have stolen this plot concept many times. I've only ever had one person go, "Hey, this is the plot from Stardust, isn't it?"
Hey, wait a minute.
We do this all the time in our games, regardless of whether or not they're based on a specific material. We take inspiration from many places.
Mm-hmm.
I actually am playing a doctor in a Traveler game currently, who I told everyone she's based on Dr. Chakwas from Mass Effect, and they're all like, "Who?" And I'm like, "Don't worry about it."
Actually, you bringing up Traveler puts me in mind of something that's kind of interesting to me, which is earlier in the hobby, you would have broad genre RPGs, like Traveler being science fiction, and people would adapt that to be more Star Trek feeling or more Star Wars feeling. And now you have things that are not based on properties that still emulate more specific genres. Like, for example, Scum and Villainy is already a serial numbers filed off version of Cowboy Bebop, if you play it a certain way.
Or Firefly.
And, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what's kind of interesting to me is, we've got subgenres even now to the point to where you don't have to file as many serial numbers off because other people have already done it.
When I was reading the opening information in Traveler, one of the interesting bits they included was you can use us to play any science fiction game you want, but if you want, here's our setting. And the setting is so deep and long that okay, we're in that setting. I don't know it, but that's what we're playing. But I thought it was interesting that they kind of threw out that caveat. You can use us to play anything you want, please.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing to keep in mind from outside of publishing, right? The reason why games have the serial numbers filed off is because licensing is difficult and expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you do see licensed properties, those come with actually a whole bunch of contractual obligations, as well as money and all of those things. Whereas Scum and Villainy gets all the advantages of Cowboy Bebop and Firefly without having to pay any publishers, negotiate contracts, have editorial overview, all of those things.
And as we have seen different licensed properties dance around different companies for reasons other than just longevity in time, it is definitely a game that I think only the hardiest of publishers can actually play.
Yeah.
Also, the nice thing is, if you play Kids on Brooms, you don't tarnish your soul by buying into an actual property that's actually horrible. Sorry.
Bravo, Jared. Good plug. Good plug. Well done. Play Strixhaven as well.
Yeah, that makes me think back to the days when I was in college and we would play mutant kids with superpowers at a boarding school. It was totally not named Xavier's. It was something completely different. We were
Starts
in
with an A,
Boston.
so-
We weren't in New York.
Oh, that's funny.
Moving on.
As long as it wasn't Massachusetts Academy.
No. That came later. I played in Massachusetts Academy later. Actually, speaking of that, let's move on to the second option, which is playing in the setting, but with completely original characters. Jared, I wanted to throw this one to you to start off with, because I know you have done this a couple of different times with different properties.
Definitely. I mean, I've run a Star Trek campaign this way. I've run multiple Star Wars campaigns this way. I ran DC Adventures where all of the players made up their own characters. I ran Dresden Files, Warhammer 40K, which is kind of weird because it's a tabletop role-playing, but it's also licensed to be RPG, which is a whole other thing. We played the old West End games Ghostbusters, which, we had our own, because yes, you could play as them, but it was also kind of fun having your own franchise and dealing with that aspect of it too. I had people play in Dishonored, and I have played Marvel games, which both have used and have not used existing Marvel characters. So yeah, there's lots going on there. I think for me as a GM, and I don't know if this is as true of the players all the time, sometimes I think it may be, I get a certain buzz off of feeling like I have told a story that fits in that universe.
Mm-hmm.
If the moral of the episode comes across and all of the players start acting like a Starfleet crew and it doesn't take any prompting or anything, it just happens. I love that. And at the end of the session, I'm like, this is why I'm running this game, because settings have feelings to them. I mean, it's that, that's the main reason to do that sort of thing. But I think you also have to be prepared to know that, one, you're going to have some players that aren't as familiar with all of the tropes.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I had Star Trek players that were familiar with the tropes. They weren't necessarily familiar with all of the details. Like, they knew Star Trek from what usually happens and how a story progresses and all that. But if you ask them specific questions about, what Faltorpan is, they're not going to say that they know that. They have no idea about that. But the point is, they understood how like an episode would progress. But the thing is, you need to be able to work with people for things like that. And you also need to realize that if somebody's having fun, maybe not playing with those tropes, that you can't just hammer it into them and say, no, play right. Because you're all there collaboratively.
You remind me of a game I played at Gen Con. We played Masks. Now, when I play Masks, I'm playing Young Justice.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's what I'm going for when I run it and when I want to play it. And I can think of two games where we had one game at Gen Con where a guy was playing somebody straight out of the Snyder Murderverse. And it was really hard. Like, the GM just didn't know what to do with this guy and was trying to do the thing of the GM says yes and, letting the player do their thing without understanding how badly that was impacting the rest of the gameplay for everyone else at the table. And then I had an experience where I was the GM where I had a player who was playing Teen Titans Go. And it was just like... it's one of the issues you can get where you have something inspired by a thing, but not specifically that thing. You can get players who are on the outside who aren't quite aligned with what's going on.
Yeah, I had a Star Wars game at one point in time, and one of the people that was playing in the game is somebody that often was in our D&D games at the local game store. And when I was, we were basically having a session 0, which is why it's important you have a session 0. He basically wanted to play like Crichton from Farscape in a Star Wars game. And I had to say, I don't want to ruin your fun. My thought process was not to go that far outside of what Star Wars has already presented as character types. And when you can do that in the session 0, it's a lot better than getting into like your third session and realizing, oh crap, he made Crichton from Farscape.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that a lot of the settings you talked about, like Star Trek, Star Wars, the Marvel Universe, the DC Universe, is there is a lot of room in those settings for players to bring in their own ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's super important. I mean, let's be honest, this is all kind of our own special version of fan fiction.
Oh, well, 100%.
Yeah.
It's exactly the reason you do it, right? Like, you want to take your spin. I know as a GM, like, I am frustrated director, right? Like, I want to direct a Star Trek episode. So I'm going to write and run a Star Trek game that feels like a Trek episode because, that's my fan fiction. Absolutely.
I have to give a shout out to my friend Carl, who has been GMing an on and off again Star Trek campaign for me and some other friends. And he has tried to introduce the mechanics of the system to us, but we keep playing Star Trek too well and solving things with intelligence and diplomacy. And, like, he had to force us into a starship battle just to show how the mechanics worked. And then when he was going to force us into ground, like face-to-face combat, we basically completely circumvented him by doing something wild and scientific to stop everything from happening. And he's like, I can't, you guys are too good at doing Star Trek. I can't win with you guys. I think the only character that's been shot is when we shot the Doctor with a stun gun to basically make him stop doing a thing he was doing under mind control. Anyway, moving on, our third option in this playing in canon is playing the characters that come from these stories. Jared, I know you mentioned you've run Marvel and DC with canon characters.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, I have with players playing them, but the other thing I was going to say is just from the GM side of things. If I'm running DC, I want to play Lex Luthor. If I am running Marvel, I want to play Doctor Doom. So even from the GM standpoint, it's not just, it's the Marvel universe and all this stuff. I want to use those toys as my villains when I'm using that type of situation. But, when you have people that are playing existing characters, and this came up actually in Marvel superheroes, a lot of people said this, were kind of surprised when Marvel Heroic Role-Playing was kind of expecting you to play the characters, but like all of the old adventure modules that came out for Marvel superheroes also kind of gave you the regular characters as pre-gens. Like they were usually set up as a type of adventure. Like this is an X-Men adventure. These are the X-Men you should probably use for it. In
fact, sometimes that was the draw as a kid.
Oh, yeah.
I don't even know if I ever ran the breeder bombs, right?
Mm-hmm.
The adventure that introduced the X-Men. I just needed the X-Men. Like I needed the stats for the X-Men. So like I quickly scooped them. That's why if you were, I'll let you continue saying, but as a kid, the holy grail of Marvel superheroes adventures was Secret Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was full of, it had a like separate, if I remember correctly, right? It wasn't like a separate book of stats.
Yeah, I think so. And the one set of adventures that I actually ran, whether I ran them right or not, I don't know, but that I actually ran were I was calling them the Cosmos Cubed ones because that was one of the adventures, but it was basically, it was a big cosmic adventure, and all the heroes were supposed to be people like Doctor Strange and Silver Surfer and Thor and Beta Ray Bill, and those are all the people that they gave you for the pre-gens. And it predated, it was on the store shelves about the same time that they brought Thanos back for the Infinity Gauntlet, but the adventures were out like a couple months before that. So it was like, oh my gosh, I have Thanos stats in here.
Now, one of the things I find with playing the characters from these settings, I much prefer it as a one-shot to a campaign. If I'm playing in a campaign, I want to kind of, it's that fan fiction thing again. I want to create my own character that lives in that world. But if I'm going to a convention and I sit down at a table where we're playing the Justice League, give me Diana, give me Wonder Woman, she's mine. I very much love playing these canon characters in one-shots. There's a few small exceptions, but for the most part, one-shots.
I think what's really good, and this is you bring up a really good point there, because for one-shots, a lot of times when people sign up for things, especially at conventions, they come in and they don't question anything about their character if they know what they're getting into. Like, if you signed up for this and I say I'm running a Marvel Heroic event and we're going to be playing the X-Men, people usually don't sit down and not go, who's this Wolverine guy? That's usually not an issue there. And I had just two people that did a great job on one night of the convention playing Cyclops and Wolverine and constantly just bickering back and forth at each other. And then the next day they played Wiccan and Hulkling. And it was amazing because they were like full on couple goals in that next session.
Let's be clear.
Great.
Let's be clear. The distance between Cyclops and Wolverine and Wiccan and Hulkling is not as far as you think it is. That is like one angry kiss away from like the pasta boiling over on the stove. Like,
and the panel has Jean in the background going, what?
But I mean, yeah, for the one-shots, people know those tropes. So when they take a character, they take the characters that they know and they understand they're going to go, I can dig into this character because I know how this character works. But what I did notice when I was running Civil War, I had people that even when they knew those characters, they would stop once in a while and go, well, I don't know, maybe I should be playing Tony more like he was in the Civil War comics. And I'm like, no, this is our version. This isn't the 616. Play him the way you want to. So it did in a campaign. I think it weighed a little bit more on people than it does in one shots where it's just like, I'm just going to hit the big, hot button things that I know about this character.
I will say as both a GM and a player, I find so much joy in sitting down at a table where you have a bunch of players get into those known characters and just play off of those relationships. Like I said, like one of the last times I got to play Wonder Woman, I had a friend playing Superman, and like we had one of those moments where I dove in and took a shot for him, and he's like, Diana, no! And just like the dynamic of all of this was fantastic. Or the times I've run Firefly and we spend over an hour with just role-playing with them, bouncing off of each other, getting that second season episode they never got before. And like just a lot of these times with these well-known characters in these well-known settings, you don't even need to flesh out like a full complicated adventure. You just need the bumper bowling to give them the lane that they're in and like just see where the players take it. Just see where they take it. Sometimes that's all you need. Any other thoughts about this topic?
No, I'll echo what you said. I think when it comes to campaigns, I always want to make my own characters. And actually, I want to distance myself from canon characters. So like maybe if I'm doing, and I guess it'll depend on the genre. If I'm doing Star Wars, you'll never see the canon characters, right?
Yeah.
Like you'll never
Star
see
Wars.
Luke.
I don't like pulling in canon characters in a Star Wars campaign.
Exactly. You'll never see those.
The movies need to stop pulling in the canon characters.
Right. Yeah. But like for Star Trek, like if the Enterprise passes by or shows up like as in a cameo or something, I'm probably okay with that because that happens all the time in the show. So like I don't know, like there's something about the canon that says like how much overlap, like the canon also will tell you how much overlap there is with the canon characters. Like if I'm running a Marvel game and everybody makes their own team, yeah, you're going to meet the Avengers. That happens in every comic book. In fact, it's like a rite of passage.
Usually they start by fighting.
Of course. Yeah. You got to do all the tropes, right? There's a misunderstanding. You're fighting, then you sort it out kind of thing. Yeah. No. And so I think with each one, like it depends on the game, but I think a lot of settings will kind of hint to how much crossover you need. My personal preference is to not cross over a lot. For those certain genres. Like if I was going to run Firefly, you're probably not going to meet Mal in the gang. Right. You'll hear about him, but you probably won't meet him. You'll just be off doing your own thing.
I think this is why, like take Dresden Files, for example. A lot of campaigns for Dresden Files, they pick a different city. Let Harry have Chicago. We're over in Boise. Just some other place that you can set some supernatural shenanigans going on that the players can get into without it having to be tied up in a known character's arc. Actually, another thing I wanted to mention real quick is with using a canon setting and canon characters, you have to worry about spoilers. You have to be careful of where do you set this. This is one of the issues that I'm trying to wrestle with the idea of doing a Horizon game. I want to set it after the end of Forbidden West, but a lot of people won't have played Forbidden West by the time I bring it to the table. Do I, hide away all of the big information? You can't do that completely because there are new groups introduced in it, so... how much do you do with the spoilers of the thing? Now some things like Star Wars, Star Trek, It's like there's enough room that you don't need to worry about spoilers, but other properties, you do need to be mindful of that when you bring it to the table.
Yeah, when I was running my DC Adventures game, I said, everything has happened in this version of the DC universe up to Final Crisis, and that's our divergence point. So if you know something going into there, you're fine, but everything doesn't have to go the way it went after that point.
Yeah, and I think that's actually probably another good tip is if you are running something canon and you want to take the pressure off yourself, that the thing you just said, the divergence point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like state where your campaign starts and have that discussion like, hey, we're going to diverge off of this. Or if you're playing like Marvel, you can just, you can quickly say like, this is not 616.
Yes.
This is, this is a different universe that diverges from this event.
In fact, I had a friend who would regularly run Marvel Saga games set in the Marvel Universe, but it was this was pre-MCU, so it was a slightly more realistic superhero setting than we had seen, and we would all make our own characters. The canon characters existed, sometimes, maybe, if he wanted to use them or not, but it was definitely Marvel, but it wasn't necessarily the same. It wasn't 616. It wasn't the known Marvel universe that everyone knows.
I ran the Breakout event like a million times because that was in the core book for Marvel Heroic. But I swapped out Sentry for Hulk as the hero that was, locked up in the raft. Because, one, I didn't want to explain to anybody that didn't know who Sentry was, because that's just more than anyone needs to deal with.
Sure.
Sentry's fascinating, but man, is that complicated.
That's not a one-shot character.
Yeah, and Hulk's a lot easier to say. Banner was worried that Hulk was going to damage things, so he turned himself in to be locked up at the raft.
Yeah.
Much easier than explaining Sentry.
Yeah, that works.
That makes sense.
Any other thoughts on this? I think we've said a lot. I don't know that there's too much more to dive into. I mean, it's the three of us. We could talk for hours.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess the cool part is, look, if you can find a licensed game for it, give it a try and see how the designers have taken a shot at it. If you really want a challenge, go and find all of the old Marvel games and see how each one of them emulates Marvel differently.
Yeah.
But yet still kind of gets there. So
yeah.
We've been talking about doing that. We've been talking about having a weekend of Marvels where we each run a different Marvel. Like I'll run Saga, Jerry would run Face Rip, Chris would run Marvel Heroic. Like just to try, just to see this is what each one of these played like.
Isn't there supposed to be another one coming?
Yes.
I thought
and there's also another one I didn't mention. There's the
one that was actually published by Marvel.
The one with the tokens and the resource tokens, or I don't know.
I don't remember that one. I just remember Face Rip, Saga, and Heroic.
All I know is I'm very proud that my players in my other Star Trek game that had never run into Admiral Nechayev did not like her, and when they watched episodes with her, they continued to not like her. So I did my job well.
Excellent job.
So I think we can start getting out of here. This show is funded by the Gnome Stew Patreon. You too can become a Patreon backer by following the Patreon link, the Gnome Stew website, to the Gnome Stew Patreon. This ad is brought to you by all of the characters from everything you've ever watched that you wanted to bring to the table, because there are so many. I have my own female version of Legolas, I'm not going to lie. If you're enjoying the Gnomecast, you'll probably like many of the other Mr. Rick and Mark shows. Here's one to check out.
On the bonus experience, Ray and Monica are two old friends exploring gameplay and design through the lens of diversity, while also sharing some of the dumbest humor gaming has to offer.
You can find all of us at gnomestew.com, at gnomestew on Twitter, and gnomestew on Facebook. Gnomes, is there anything else you'd like to point our listeners towards?
Well, you can find any review that I don't put on Gnome Stew at whatdoiknowjr.com. And I'd also like to point out, I think this will still be running by the time this podcast gets published. DriveThruRPG and Dungeon Masters Guild are both doing Ukraine relief bundles that are donating to Doctors Without Borders. So you may want to go there and check those things out.
Awesome. So, do you think we avoided the stew this week? Is somebody doing a canon version of Hell's Kitchen with Gordon Ramsay as a character?
Gnomecast is hosted by Misdirected Mark Productions, the media arm of Encoded Designs.
He basically wanted to play like Michael Crichton from oh my gosh, why can't I remember the name of the show? I remember the astronaut's name. Anyway, from Farscape. He wanted to play
John Crichton.
John Crichton. Michael Crichton is the author.
Correct.
John Crichton